to this type of format, what I usually do is I'll stream live on Periscope and then I'll talk about a particular topic. This is an older topic that was voted on by viewers way back like 7 months ago, but I had a different form of streaming at the time where I was just streaming from my phone. And this is one of the more popular streams that I did, so I thought I would go back and discuss the science of cannabis again with a bit more detail and better graphics. So let's get started. Love my intro video. Gonna Go For It made it for me, so that was pretty cool of him to do that. So I guess what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back over a little bit of what cannabis is, what it does, how it works in the brain, and all of the different types of things that are associated with. Is it helpful for medical purposes, and what kind of health risks are associated? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what science has for us for that. So yes, cannabis. What is it? What does it do? What are the pros and cons? Well, the first thing we have to talk about in regards to cannabis is that it is a cannabinoid. It's a cellular receptor it's a ligand that attaches to a cellular receptor. Now, if you're unfamiliar with cellular receptors, essentially what they are is that they're antennas that stick out on the outside of the cells, and that's how cells kind of talk to each other. Do I believe in it, and would I use it? I don't know if it's like if I believe in it or not. It's a thing that exists and it does things to the body. I think I have to have more information in regards to science as to what the effects are and if it would be beneficial for me in any kind of way. So I kind of need more information on that. And so that's one of the things I'm going to talk about, what the barriers of research are in regards to cannabis. So cellular receptors are how cells talk to one another, and they can release certain compounds, and then they attach to the receptor, and then that initiates a response. Oh, yay. So if you have questions, if you're on the live stream, just ask me, and I'll be happy to answer them as we go along. And so what we see in this little graphic here is we see this little wrench looking thing. That's our receptor. Now the little, is that an octagon? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. No, that's a hexagon. I had to count. That is attaching to our receptor. And then we have this other protein that comes along and it attaches to that receptor on the bottom. And that initiates all the cellular responses within the cell. So it's important for us to kind of understand that cannabis is our hexagon. That is what attaches to the receptors and gets things going. So cannabis is our hexagon in this picture, and it's a cannabinoid. So let's take a look at what happens with neurotransmitters. So let's say your little hexagon fits into that wrench shape, that receptor, and then it initiates a cellular response across a neuron. A neuron is inside your brain, and it releases different things called neurotransmitters. And so these particular neurotransmitters actually cause us to feel different things. And so once these receptors are activated by a cannabinoid, it causes this pulse to go through the receptor, and then it passes the neurotransmitter through a synapse to the next neuron. So let's have a look, a bit detailed. So one of the most common cannabinoids that's found in cannabis is THC, and we'll look at those chemical compounds here in a second. So what we have in this particular picture, we have our THC. It's not a hexagon in this picture. It looks like a green jet, and it attaches to the cannabinoid receptor, and it allows this pulse, it initiates the cellular response in order to release neurotransmitters in that little synapse. Now the synapse is the space in between the two neurons, and this allows us to feel the things that we feel. Okay? So let's have a look at what these chemical compounds look like that we find in cannabis, because the chemist in me wants to make sure you know what the chemical formulas look like, right? So we need to know, and we're going to talk mainly about two of them. So here we have, if we have a natural endocannabinol system in our brains, then a plant with a cannabinol compound is is what? I'm not certain what you were asking me. All right, so let's talk about, we have tetrahydrocannabinol, cannabidiol, we have cannabidiol, and cannabinol, CBN. Basically just boosting our own system. Well, you have, the reason why it's called that, these are not the only cannabinoids that you can have, and these receptors, they can be fired off with other different compounds as well. So it's not just exclusively to cannabis. They're not just made just for cannabis. They initiate other cellular responses as well. And there's other compounds that do that. So it's not just made just for cannabis. So let's kind of not think that way, because the receptors there are there, and they have different compounds that can actually attach to it that can stop it and also can fire it off. So we have agonists and we have antagonists. So all right, so these are the chemical compounds here that we're looking at. So THC is probably the one that you guys are most familiar with, right? Because you hear about that all the time. True, the fact that it works says a lot though. Well, I mean, you know, we also have arsenic and other things that can work on your body. Doesn't necessarily mean we want to use it though, but I'm not comparing the two, because clearly they're in regards to what they do is very different. But if we're going with the whole thing, if it does something, it must be good. That's not necessarily the case. So there's a difference between, I mean, you know, you take enough of anything, it's going to initiate a particular response. All right, so we're looking at THC, CBD, CBG, and CBN. These are 4 different types of cannabinoids that can be found in cannabis. So these ones that we have here, we have different receptors. Poor analogy. CB1 and CB2. These are the 2 main receptors that I'm going to be focusing on, although there are TRPV1 and TRPA1, all right? But the ones that we mostly associate with cannabis are CB1 and CB2, all right? And these you can find in various parts of the body. And so what they've got here for this particular graphic, why there's a lock and key kind of idea, and that's often taught in biology, is that a particular compound fits like a key inside a receptor that's like a lock. And so this particular graphic kind of gives you the idea that CBN fits really in CB2, and that THC fires off the CB1. All right, so let's keep that in mind, because you guys are familiar with the THC, but CBN is also in cannabis. So let's talk about which parts of the body those affect. So if we're looking at the amount of receptors and where we can find those antennae that stick out on the outside of cells that initiate these cellular responses to make us feel certain things if we were to intake some cannabis, whether orally or smoking it. CB1, the highest concentration of receptors for CB1 is found primarily in the brain, the nervous system, skeletal muscle, liver, pancreas, and also fat cells. CB2 we find highly expressed in the immune system, okay? So you might start thinking, okay, so if I'm taking cannabis, the parts of my body that are going to be affected are largely brain, okay, because we feel things, nervous system, skeletal muscle, all of these different tissues and organs. This would lead on to a great piece regarding psychedelics. They have the same lock and key scenario. Oh, well, you know, maybe that can be a topic for another Science Of, is to talk about psychedelics. All right, and then CB2, we see a high expression of that primarily in the immune system. So health effects. Does this hurt us? Is it beneficial? Is it harmful? What are all the different things that are associated when it comes to cannabis? What does science say? What do we know about this? Well, let me tell you, there's a thing that you can look up. And if you check out, and I'll put my slides on my website, scientistsmell.com. So if you're curious as to what my sources are, I've got all my links for all of my information where you can go and you can dig in further. All right, let's talk about this. We know that cannabis has been associated with various health effects, both positive and negative. Well, in January of this year, 2017, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, Medicines presented nearly 100 conclusions associated to the effects of cannabis and cannabinoid use. They assessed both smoking and ingested cannabis from natural and synthetic sources because we can synthesize cannabinoids in the lab, so we can actually make it in the lab. And they measured various studies. So this is like what you would call a literature review. They went through and they found all of these different studies, and they measured these on evidence. They measured their evidence based on conclusive, substantial, moderate, limited, or no or insufficient evidence. So what they did is they went through and they developed a rubric to be able to determine whether there was conclusive evidence, substantial evidence, moderate evidence, limited, or nah, So what does it mean? The difference between, for instance, substantial and conclusive. All right. Conclusive is that the conclusive shows randomized controlled trials with no credible opposing findings. So they couldn't find anything that opposed these particular findings. So that means it's conclusive. All right. Substantial means it's good quality studies, but there might still be some bias, chance, and minor limitations that can't be ruled out as of yet. Too many interruptions. Will you post this elsewhere? I'd like to watch it straight through. Yes. I will post this on my YouTube channel, so youtube.com/c/scientistmel, or just Google me on YouTube Scientist Mel, and you'll be able to find it. It'll pop up on my latest video on my channel. All right, and so as we move down through the list, the quality of studies and removal of factors and bias decreases with each evidence level. So moderate means we got a few more factors to worry about. Limited means, oh, we got some opposing views, and so on. Excuse me. And thus starts our coughing spell. I have been battling coughing, so I'm sorry. If you were here with me last week, apologies for the coughing. So, excuse me. So what did they report? What did they find in their studies? So let's see. You guys surviving? So what did these individuals find? What did they find in their studies? For health benefits. In adults with chemotherapy, and I'm pulling this from their report, so I want to make sure I give credit where credit's due, and I'm pulling this directly from their reports. Excuse me. So in adults with chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, the oral cannabinoids were effective as antiemetics. So that means people who have chemotherapy, the cannabinoids actually helped with that type of nausea and vomiting. So it kind of, it helped with that. In adults with chronic pain, the patients who are treated with cannabis or cannabinoids are more likely to experience significant reduction in their pain. So in regards to chronic pain, this is shown to be quite effective to help those particular individuals. Same thing with multiple sclerosis. So the jerky movements that we associate with multiple sclerosis are also called related spasticity. Short-term use of cannabinoids improves these particular symptoms, so they see less of these when they use it. Now for these conditions, the effects of cannabinoids are modest. It's not substantial or huge, but it's there. And for the other conditions they evaluated, they looked at cancer, they looked at mental health types of things. There's not enough information to assess their effects. So we need more research in that. So those are some of the health benefits that we talk about in regards to cannabis. So let's talk about the health risks. Warning, warning, you know. What does science say in regards to these health risks, you know? What is myth and what is fact in this? So we have to kind of look at both sides of the coin, because we know that there's usually pros and cons with everything, even with medical treatments. We know there can be harsh side effects. So I want to show you the things that they took a look at. So the things, and I won't keep it on this big giant screen long. So what they looked at were cancer. You use it for nerve damage and leg spasms due to back injury. You know, and they did take a look at that when they were assessing the different studies associated. Better than a cocktail of pharmaceuticals. You know, and it might be for individuals, but I think that's up to a person's doctor and also what the current science says. And, you know, your doctor is going to know what you need better than just the standard internet, I would think, because they know your medical history as well. So the risks, they took a look at cancer, immunity, psychosocial, cardiometabolic, injury, death, mental health, respiratory disease, everything to do with mothers and babies, as well as substance abuse. They also looked at whether or not marijuana was a gateway drug. So they wanted to look at the studies and see, because you hear, well, marijuana is a gateway drug and it can cause cancer and lung cancer and all of these different things. So they wanted to take a look at this and essentially just say, all right, what does science say? So the conclusions for cancer, everybody's scared of cancer. There is moderate evidence of no statistical association between cannabis use and lung cancer. All right. So there's no statistical, there is moderate evidence of no statistical association. So let me phrase that. They have evidence to show that there's no link between cannabis use and lung cancer. All right. But it's not a lot. It's not substantial or conclusive. It's moderate. And they also looked at that in regards to head and neck cancers, and they found again that there's moderate evidence to show that there's no link between cannabis and head and neck cancers, but it's not conclusive. There's limited evidence to show that there is a link between cannabis smoking and testicular germ cell tumors. Current, frequent, chronic cannabis smoking, they looked at all of these. Now, in regards to insufficient evidence, there's insufficient evidence to support or refute a statistical association between cannabis and esophageal cancer, prostate cancer, cervical cancer, malignant gliomas, penile cancer, anal cancer, Kaposi sarcoma, or bladder cancer. So they don't have enough evidence to support or refute a link between cannabis and other various types of cancers, including leukemia, as well as non-lymphoblastic and acute lymphoblastic leukemia. So we don't know a whole lot in regards to all of the other bodily cancers outside of lung, head, and neck. So that's a bit problematic. Now, as far as cardiometabolic risk, it's really unclear in regards to the evidence to how cannabis use is associated with heart attack, stroke, and diabetes. So we don't know 100% if there is a link between heart attack, stroke, and diabetes and cannabis use. We need more research for that. For respiratory diseases, those are things like COPD, asthma, things like that. There is a substantial amount of evidence to associate long-term cannabis smoking and worse respiratory systems and more frequent chronic bronchitis episodes. So if you have bronchitis already, the longer you smoke cannabis, you are likely to have a higher risk of respiratory systems. There is moderate evidence to show that you can have improved airway dynamics with acute use, but not chronic use. So you might have better airway flow if you use it on an acute type of level, not daily or chronic. There's also a link to higher forced vital capacity, also known as FVC. So what is that? That's where you can hold in more, well, you can blow out and expel more oxygen from your lungs. So you develop a skill for that. Who'd have thought? And there is a link between cessation of cannabis smoking and improvements in respiratory systems. So if you have symptoms, if you have chronic type of bronchitis and you smoke cannabis, if you come off of the cannabis, your symptoms will actually improve. Now, as far as limited evidence, there's limited evidence between occasional cannabis smoking and an increased risk of developing COPD. COPD we normally see with tobacco users. And so they took a study and they did a control between looking at cannabis smokers versus tobacco use, and they found that there's limited evidence to connect the two. We need more studies. And there's insufficient or just not enough evidence to support or refute an association of cannabis with hospital admissions for COPD as well as asthma develop or asthma exacerbation. So we don't know how cannabis smoking affects asthma as well as asthma development. So that's a thing. What about your immunity? I'm going through it. If you have questions, just ask me. So immune systems, excuse me. There exists a paucity of data on the effects of cannabis or cannabinoid-based therapeutics on the human immune system. So we see some data for that, but there's not enough data to draw overarching conclusions concerning the effects of cannabis smoke or cannabinoids, that's even taking it orally, on the immune competence. So we don't really see a lot of positive or negative effects to kind of deal with the immune system. It's hard for studies to be done when the DEA and U.S. government keep it as a Schedule I drug. Yes, and that's one of the barriers that researchers have in regards to cannabis study, and its regulatory barrier in regards to that, in it being a Schedule I drug. So yeah. Now there's limited evidence to suggest that regular exposure to cannabis may have anti-inflammatory activity. So there's not a whole lot of evidence to show that there's anti-inflammatory effects of cannabis, which means you take Tylenol or ibuprofen to kind of, it's called an anti-inflammatory. So they don't have a lot of evidence that associates cannabis with that. And there's not much evidence at all to support or refute an association between cannabis, cannabinoids, and any kind of adverse effects on compromised immune systems, such as those with HIV. So we don't have any evidence, or there's just not enough to call it, on whether or not cannabis has an effect on those with compromised immune systems. Injury and death. Some of you guys are like, nobody has ever overdosed on pot. And so, what did they find? What did the academies of all of those sciences find in regards to energy and death? All right, cannabis use prior to driving increases the risk of being involved in a motor vehicle accident. Yes. If you're driving under the influence, you're going to have an increased risk of having a car accident. I think that kind of goes without saying. Now, in states where cannabis is legal, there is an increased risk of unintentional cannabis overdose injuries among children. It is unclear on how cannabis use is associated with all-cause mortality or with occupational injury. I almost said energy. It's injury. So they don't have enough evidence to show if there is any kind of occupational injuries associated with people using cannabis. Excuse me. For the moms, smoking cannabis during pregnancy is linked to lower birth weight in the infant. We also see that with tobacco use. The relationship between smoking cannabis during pregnancy and other pregnancies and childhood outcomes is unclear. Now, what they mean by that is they don't know, or they don't have enough evidence to associate mothers who smoked cannabis while pregnant. They don't have enough evidence to see how their children are affected academically, socially, if there's any kind of mental disorders that are developed from that. So we don't know what happens with the children in regards, or at least have any type of evidence to show that cannabis affected whether or not a child after they were born whose mother smoked it has any effect on them socially, academically, developmentally. We just don't have that evidence. Psychosocial. So in regards to cognitive domains of learning, we've got recent cannabis use impairs that ability. All right, so if you just start using, recent use may be defined as cannabis use within 24 hours. So if you use it within 24 hours, you're going to have some impairment. But there's a limited number of studies that suggest there are impairments in cognitive domains of learning as far as in attention and details who have stopped smoking cannabis. So we don't have a lot of studies to see if there's any impairment long term after somebody stops using cannabis. But cannabis use during adolescence is related to impairments in subsequent academic achievement in education, employment and income, and social relationships and social roles. So if we see cannabis use within adolescence, it is going to affect their academic achievement, education, where they work, how much money they get, as well as how they interact with individuals and their social roles. So there is evidence for that, which means it needs to be especially regulated and watched with younger individuals. Almost done with all this stuff. We're getting to, is cannabis a gateway drug? Mental health. Now, there's some substantial evidence in regards to mental health that there's association between cannabis use and the development of schizophrenia or other psychoses, with the highest risk among frequent users. What does that mean? That means if certain psychoses are genetic in your family, you can have a look, especially if there's schizophrenia. Cannabis use can have that onset of schizophrenia happen a lot sooner, and you can develop that. And so if you're a frequent user and certain type of psychoses run in your family, you could inadvertently develop one of the schizophrenia or the other psychosis they looked into. In individuals with schizophrenia and other psychoses, a history of cannabis use may be linked to better performance on learning and memory tasks, though. Cannabis does not appear to increase the likelihood of developing depression or anxiety or PTSD, also known as post-traumatic stress disorder, so we don't have an increased likelihood of that. Use, never misuse, or abuse. And we're going to talk about the abuses of cannabis and what happens if linked to that. For individuals with bipolar disorder, near daily cannabis use may be linked to greater symptoms of bipolar disorder than non-users. So when you're comparing bipolar individuals who use cannabis to those who do not use cannabis, who are both bipolar, those who nearly use it every day are more likely to have greater symptoms. Heavy cannabis users are more likely to report thoughts of suicide than non-users, and regular cannabis use is likely to increase the risk of developing social anxiety disorders. So in regards to mental health, there's actually not much benefit whatsoever if you suffer bipolar, schizophrenia. It could have onset of schizophrenia. Good news is it's not linked to increasing depression or anxiety or PTSD, but people who are on it who already suffer those things might have more reports of thoughts of suicide than non-users. So what if we overuse cannabis? Problems for cannabis use. Greater frequency increases the likelihood of developing a problem. All right. Initiating cannabis use at a younger age also increases the likelihood of developing problem cannabis use, meaning doing it all the time. So what are the links to other substances? People say it's a gateway drug. Well, there's limited evidence of a statistical association between cannabis and tobacco, starting tobacco. So if you're smoking cannabis, we just don't have a lot of evidence to show that a link between cannabis is going to get you to start tobacco. Same with cannabis use and changes in the rates of use patterns of other illicit and illicit substances. However, there is moderate evidence between cannabis use and the development of substance dependence and/or substance abuse disorder for substances like alcohol, tobacco, and other illicit drugs. So, it may not necessarily be a gateway drug, but if you've already had those other things, there is moderate evidence to show that there is a development of a substance dependence or abuse disorder on things like alcohol and tobacco and possibly other drugs. So it may not be a gateway drug, but if you've already utilized these other drugs, they can exacerbate abuse when we see it in alcohol, tobacco, and other illicit drugs. So those are the pros and cons, the health risks and the health problems associated with cannabis. Let's talk a little bit about what the particular problems are when it comes to cannabis research. This is what we got. There are many barriers to cannabis research. First of all, it's a Schedule I substance, meaning that since it's a Schedule I substance, it's highly regulated by the government, and it makes it hard to get an ample amount. And not only do researchers need an ample amount, they need a certain type of quality and a type of cannabis in order to get these particular studies going. Funding is an issue. Not everybody is interested in funding cannabis research. And so having a diverse network of funding is extremely important. They also need improved experimental methods. They need more controlled trials. And the other thing is they need people that use for short and long-term health outcomes. So we have a lot of barriers here in regards to cannabis research, but since some states have made it legal, it'll make it a bit easier in regards to finding that particular research that we need. At least the different barriers are kind of overcome in that regard, so that we'll be able to get what we need. It looks like my streaming has gone down a bit. Not certain what's happened, but that's okay. I'm going to keep going. Anyway, to finish up, cannabis research, what is it? Or cannabis overall, what is it? Well, it's a cannabinoid, and it initiates cellular processes. And these particular cannabinoids attach to receptors, and these receptors fire off and initiate these various cellular processes. There are pros and cons. There are some health benefits and also some health risks, but more research is needed in order to achieve what we need in regards to those big massive holes that we have in research. Now I'm going to take a moment to show you all of my sources. These are as you see, there's so many sources here. It's not that many, but I'll put these on my website so you can have access to them anytime you want on sciencesmel.com, and you can click on these different studies. And if you need more references or any more sources, you can hit me up on Twitter on sciencesmel. I want to take a moment to thank all of my patrons on patreon.com. Tony, Lauren, Anonymous, Mark, Jen, Carl, Melanie, Anthony, Paula, Carrie, Keith, Zachary, Patrick, Tony, Graham, Tristan, and Jennifer. thank you for your help on my Patreon account. They also have access to my podcast a week in advance on any new episodes that I post there. They also have access to exclusive content. Thank you, and my patrons start at $1 a month. You can find me everywhere. Scientistmel.com primarily. You can find me on patreon.com/scientistmel. I'm also on YouTube and Facebook. And that has been the Science of Cannabis. I think we're having issues on Periscope right now. So if I didn't get your questions, I apologize for that. And if you missed the broadcast, I will be posting this on YouTube shortly. So thank you so much. I hope you guys have a fabulous day. Bye.